I'm following in the footsteps of giants, and it's particularly potent. The last discussion about seeds reminded me of famous American folk hero Johnny Appleseed, who moved around most of what is today the state of New York and in other parts of the Northeast. One of the reasons that he walked around putting apple seed was that he was orphaned at a young age, and that was his testament to the loss of his mother. And he wanted the way she left him as a seed, he wanted to leave many other seeds for those who will come after him. So I think it's a wonderful imagery to think of seeds of love and seeds of cooperation as something that puts us together. Indeed, if I can give you a spoilers alert, the takeaway from my talk is going to be about inclusion, about how to educate, how to work together, how to overcome the divide, which could be historical, could be ethnic, could be religious, could be socioeconomic, and often is also racial, and something which is very hurtful. If while I'm talking, when I ask questions, just raise your hand. I'm very interactive. When I'm getting to be talking too much, or if you need to stop, to just do this sign, please use all 5 fingers. Or if I talk too fast, which sometimes happens to me too, when I get excited with such a wonderful crowd, again, do this and I'll say it back. When I was in law school, the worst professor we had would get to the point of the end of the class and say, oh, I'm out of time, but the main point of the day is. So I remember that we always want to know what is the lesson. So I'm hoping to impart the lesson that, especially in France, where is by most accounts a powder keg, the combination of historical memory, of hurtfulness, of a lack of access to education, to options of enhancement, one's personality, self-esteem, options in life, that kind of lack of access is fortified or perhaps worsened by historical memory. And I think there's a way to take out of it several elements which are hurtful and make them productive. So basically make the negative into positive, to put 2 negatives into a positive. What I mean by that is, in France, the vast majority of what my great uncle Karl Marx, it's a joke, used to call the working class, the permanent working class, are now mostly people of color, mostly people who are not Christian, namely mostly blacks and Muslims. They live in places called Banlieue. Banlieue would translate in English to some sort of a suburb, but in French, it has a very sad connotation. Would we perhaps translate better as banlieues who are also slums. These areas, which are in every major French city, especially Paris is infamous for that, are places where young, mostly African and Muslim men have little prospects. And they are kind of torn apart by 3 main issues. The first is they live in France but not of France. They're French citizens, they speak French, they live in French culture, but no mainstream white Christian French person would think of them as fellow French. Some would, and they are very pious and wonderful people. Sure. So, good. Now I will talk less, but I hope with more substance. As my favorite professor in law school said, less is more. So I'll do it in a more condensed version. So the first point is that those people are living in France, but not of France. They're not really French culturally, religiously. And in French, people are supposed to be very secular and very inclusive, but the reality is that they are not. Second point is those banlieues are full of tragedies, poverty, crime, distress, lack of opportunities, lack of hope, misery. And that's fortified by the sense of victimhood, which is historical. A history of the Christian and Muslim interaction has not been kind. And most of those people who came to France came there mostly as a result of colonialism, namely their former countries, mostly in North Africa, but also parts of West Africa, and sometimes in other continents, were colonized by the French. The French has an expression that causes me shivers every time I say it. It was mission civilisatrice, translated as a civilizing mission. The British had a very similar expression, which is also quite horrendous, which was a white man's burden. The point being that the mere presence of those people who are French by nationality and citizenship, but not by most accounts ethnicity, religion, color of skin, is a testament to the fact that they were defeated, they were vanquished. They did not come to France because they were victors, but because their ancestors were taken over by the French project, by imperial powers, and thus took over their countries and took over their resources, and often took over their identity. And that issue is not lost on any French of a background which is not white and Christian. That they're there basically as a permanent working class, people who have thought to be different. The term othering is almost written in French. They're othered. They're officially French, but nobody really, most people in France sadly will not take them as one. In the interest of time, I'll cut to what I think can be done, and if I have more time, I'll go into more details historically. The first issue is that the French historical project since the French Revolution of liberty, equality, solidarity usually neglects to mention there was a fourth principle. Anybody here knows what was the fourth principle of those people who struggled in July 1789 after they took over the Bastille? It's rarely taught. It was mort, death. It was meant, of course, that they will be strong to death. They'll fight as hard as they can, risk their lives. And that means that they were very zealot. So you hear about liberty, equality, and solidarity, which sounds very nice. And also remember that these guys were willing to die for it, which is good in some respects, but in other respects means that that French project was not only benevolent. If you study in most of the Western countries, it's a great time. Sadly, there was that reign of terror with the guillotine, but otherwise it was always nice. And especially what I teach history of human rights, it's become to mean a sense of everybody's included. It's all for us. It can be global. It's all of all people. Sadly, that's not how the French history works. So the first element would be to educate that in France, while it's wonderful in many respects, has great culture and so forth, the French national ethos is based in large part on exclusion, on violence, and on the ability to use state power in a very oppressive way. Secondly, is that in the 19th century, especially in the 20th century, the French welfare state took big strides in educating people, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of vocationalism. That kind of education is now quite lacking in those banlieues. And if you're a typical French white working class person, you get it. In those schools, it's very hard to get because they're overcrowded, they're under-equipped, and they're ill-served. Basically, think of what happened in the US South during the era of Jim Crow laws. You'll get a photo of that picture. Secondly, the issue of placement. The French system, again, theoretically, is meant to be inclusive and all are welcome, and as long as you speak French and you love the state, you're great. No. In the French system, the reality is that it's based on connections. What in the US is called the old boys network. In French society, unless you went to the right place at the right time with the right cousin and friends, your access to real positions is very limited. Which means that those poor Muslims and Africans tend to be not just felt discriminated against and othered, but they know they have no real prospects. For all one glorious story of somebody who's doing well, many others are left behind. So affirmative action, to use the American term, would be another measure that could take away that victimhood and make it to channel it into more positive manners. This is something that we can learn. Another issue is the issue of civil rights. The US civil rights is used mostly in the context of African Americans lacking access to voting and being elected. And seeing what's going on right now in the election process, sadly that struggle still continues. In France, civil rights would be more the ability to express oneself fully. For example, the fact that in France it could be punishable by law to wear artifacts, religious artifacts, from hijab, I think it's pronounced. I apologize if I don't pronounce correctly. And for some Sikhs and for some Jews, it seems that in France, it's thought to be an offense that somebody expresses their identity freely. It's not coerced, and it's not something that they feel ashamed of. On the contrary, they feel that it gives them a sense of pride. I think it's a travesty that in France, the mother of all these wonderful principles we discussed earlier, people who fully and freely would like to express themselves in a religious way not only feel frowned upon, but can literally lose civil rights, including jail time and fine for expressing who they are. And the same goes, by the way, for the most basic foods. That there are some countries in which the using halal or kosher meat seems to be a violation. I'm a vegetarian personally, but I think it's wonderful when people want to do things their way and religiously. And I think one of the remedies we should look forward is having a more inclusive way of seeing other people's rituals as a strength rather than as a sort of weakness or something weird. Last but not least, when you go around France, and for that matter also other parts of Europe, especially Britain, to a lesser extent Italy, one always notices that the sad parts of town and the sad parts of train station, and the people who look around more in a sense of hunched and somewhat shamed, tend to be people who are not white. And there's a sense of lack of belonging, a lack of empathy, perhaps following up on that others, that they're basically become invisible. Think of it in American terms as how you walk around people who are homeless, or people who are obviously having some serious problems. Many of you, and I think in this crowd it's the exception, will try and help them feel sympathy, feel empathy, would embrace them, would include them, saying we're all one. Sadly, as a society, most Western countries lack that kind of resource. And when you have social workers, and that's my point about the more inclusive part, social workers in the US and Europe are mostly channeled towards groups that are within the national consensus. Namely, they could be poor, but they could be misunderstood, but they're rarely the minorities. So one of the issues that I think the mere term minority and the mere expression of there's majority minority is not just discriminatory, but offensive. And it becomes less and less helpful when it's used in the context of further victimhood. And I would also say that, as I conclude soon, that I teach history, as you heard, in the history of human rights and world civilizations. I see textbooks, multiple of them, in many dimensions of law, legal history, human rights history, general history, social history, immigration history. I'm yet to find really books and textbooks that not just try to integrate, and many of them do try to integrate, but they look at things from different perspectives all the time. That it's not just from the perspective of the victor, the Western society, but from the perspective of the vanquished, of those who suffered indignity. And I think part of the start of studying a new dialogue, of looking into things in a better way, is the last term I will leave you with. The term I think you should all Google if you haven't heard of it before. It's called commensurability. Commensurability. Basically a fruitful dialogue as equals between different societies and different religions, different civilizations. It's used mostly in the US context to show that early American settlers from Europe learned a lot from Native Americans. So commensurability, not just in case of historical issues, but also in terms of current practices, can be have a major impact to make us all feel that we're one equal, and our mission is to come together, and while we have differences of identity, we're all human. Thank you so much.